Hello, America, how are you? In a time when suspicion, misinformation, and division threaten to unravel our shared story, we believe it's time to listen again. Here on the Voices of Americans, we gather real people for real conversations, sharing truths, not just headlines. Stories have always been the heartbeat of change, and like the words etched into our currency, e pluribus unum, out of many one, we believe that by listening to each other, we can remember who we are and imagine who we might become. This is Voices of Americans. Hello, America. How are you? This is episode 9 of Voices of Americans, and I'm pleased today to remind you that our co-host, attorney Larry Wallace, is going to be here in an important part of this conversation. But we have as our guest, I'll introduce first, Dr. Amanda Rogers. Amanda is a political violence scholar, a media analyst, and a cultural commentator whose work spans continents and crises. She is currently a fellow at the Century Foundation. She researches transnational extremist movements and non-state armed groups from ISIS to neo-Nazi accelerationism. Her writing and analysis appear in New York Times, CNN, The Intercept, and the Atlantic Council, among others. She has a PhD from Emory University and has done some deep field experience across Africa, South Asia, and the Middle East. Amanda brings a unique lens to global strategy, public discourse, and the cultural narratives that are currently shaping all of our lives in the political arena. Attorney Larry Wallace is an environmental justice attorney, policy strategist, and co-host of this podcast, a graduate of Vanderbilt and Harvard Law School. Larry has worked at every level of government, from local initiatives in Atlanta to federal agencies like the EPA and the Department of Justice. He helped shape key environmental policies, including contributions to the Superfund program of the EPA, and has advised multiple U.S. presidents. Known for his deep commitment to equity, civic engagement, and truth-telling, Larry brings a sharp legal mind and a storyteller's heart to conversations that move beyond sound bites into systems and into the soul of American life. So, Amanda, we are glad you're here, and you're going to help us explore this episode's big question. And that question is, what are we missing when we stop listening across ideology, across institutions, and across identity? And what might happen if we started tuning back in with more curiosity, more humility, and more discipline? So this isn't just a conversation about extremists and extremism. It's about all of us. So, Larry, you want to get us into this?
Yeah. Quite frankly, the first thing I want to learn and know from Amanda is, what should each of us be doing today? I entered the federal government during the Carter administration, and there were a few attempts to blow up, for example, the basement of the World Trade Center, the garage, and of course 9/11 had not happened. But having that history, having the threats be what they have been announced to be, for example, during Christopher Wray's leadership of the FBI, domestic terrorism was the highlight and the worst fear that the FBI was on the lookout for. So given our attacking the nuclear facilities in Iran, and given the situations in both Ukraine and with Israel and Iran, what should we be concerned about today? And how have things changed, Amanda?
Well, thank you for having me. First of all, it's great to be here. Secondly, wow, you both opened with questions that I think we could talk for 2 weeks straight, about and not necessarily solve the world's problems, although I'd love to. I think that one of the things that I'll say that probably will be surprising somewhat to both of you, I would imagine, is what can anyone do as far as a pragmatic act of resistance to the things that we're seeing? I think that although when this question gets asked, most people want to know what can we do in terms of pressuring politicians or rolling back ICE raids, et cetera, things like that. I think that it's equally important to focus on empathy, despite what Elon Musk has to say about empathy being suicidal. I think he misunderstands this concept. And I'll get back to that in a later conversation if you like. But accountability, personal accountability, and acknowledging systems of power that we all take part in, I think is the most important thing that we can do, coupled with an active empathy and listening. And these are not separated from geopolitics or domestic politics in any way, shape, or form. I think that one of the perfect examples is actually what Larry asked about Iran. When I talk about empathy and personal accountability, let me frame this with what I used to tell my students when I taught intro Middle East or security studies courses, or any course for that matter. But I would start with telling them, I'm not smarter than you. I'm just more experienced in an older period. It's okay to be wrong. It's fantastic to be wrong. No one can know everything, etc. Ignorance is a gift, actually. Destigmatize the idea that if you don't know something, that's a personal moral failing, or it's tantamount to prejudice, because those are not the same things. I think what we see across the world is this just massive failure to ever admit to being wrong. And that leads to a very myopic view of history, of foreign relationships. Iran is a kind of a great, I guess, test tube sort of example of what I'm talking about. How many times has an Iranian national conducted a terrorist attack within the contiguous United States, or, I guess, United States, including Hawaii and Alaska?
I'm not aware of many, if any.
Never. Never,
Okay.
correct, right? I mean, there have been thwarted kidnapping attempts, I think, a couple times, but by and large, this is not an issue that has ever been one for the United States, let alone an existential threat that would merit the kind of discourse that we see. We need to be thinking about whose interests that discourse serves, right? We talk about fear a lot, I think, in this conversation is where you're wanting to head, but that provides a great example, because people don't want to admit that they don't know anything about Iran. And too often they fall into these categories of predetermined partisan cheerleaderships, right? And there's a fear of being critical of one's own party. I mean, I am on the left. I'm further left than the Democrats. I have no shame admitting that. And I'm fine with criticizing all the Democrats that are rallying for war on Iran right now. People talk about Iran as this enormous existential threat to the United States, but they can't tell you who Prime Minister Mossadegh was, or how the overthrow of organic democracy in Iran and the replacement with organic democracy of, a U.S. And UK puppet, I will absolutely call the Shah that, who tortured his own people and was rightly perceived to a certain extent of taking their resources, in turn ushered in the reign of Khomeini and the Islamic Republic that we see today, which I want to be very clear I don't support. But so there's an idea that Iran is this ancient existential threat, and it's because of religion and civilization and so on and so forth, with absolutely no history behind it. And that kind of thinking and lack of critical awareness is devastating for the possibilities of peace, in not only in the region and the world, domestically, etc. It also leaves our citizens ripe for manipulation, whether that is people who claim false flags will happen, or victims of false flags, or and so on and so forth. So these issues have been around for a long time, what I think we all need to work on, but they've been exacerbated in the past 10, 20 years to an alarming degree, and in the past, I would say, 5 years to a horrifying degree.
Okay, before we leave Iran, let me ask you about another particular aspect. I understand from your information that we don't have an actual history, but what about the distinction that Iran is a government, and therefore you have the aspect of state-sponsored, and even though their citizens or others who call it home may not have engaged in this type of activity, what about their willingness as a government with millions and millions of dollars of money to pay others who don't have the money but have the interest in attacking us?
I think that actually raises a fantastic series of discussion points, and I'm glad you brought it up. For one thing, it gets us into the idea of terrorism itself. I rant about this all the time, but I think that we should be clear about the fact that let's look at the origins of the term terrorism in modern discourse. It dates back to the French Revolution, actually, and specifically the Jacobin period, right? So terrorism as a tactic, a political tactic, originated with the French revolutionary government acting against its own citizens. So the use of the word terrorism in the first place originally referred to state acts of terrorism, not non-state armed groups in the sense that we traditionally use it. That's one point I think that's absolutely critical to keep in mind. Another point that's critical to keep in mind is before we can even discuss, Iran's behavior in terms of terrorism vis-a-vis any other country's, sponsorship of proxies, etc., we have to look at the definitions of terrorism. The United States cannot agree in any governmental or law enforcement body on what per se constitutes terrorism. For example, FBI, DHS, NYPD, etc., all across the country, you do not have one cohesive definition of what constitutes terrorism within the United States. Second of all, there's FBI is a classic example because the FBI, in its threat categories of what constitute, terrorism is a definitional distinction, not a charging distinction. Why that's important here is because, as the FBI itself notes, the idea of extremist ideology or radicalism is protected free speech in this country. So it's an enhancement for, say, a conviction, right? But like in the letter of the law for the FBI, they're saying that itself domestically is not a crime. You have to be connected to a foreign actor for that to be a crime. These definitions are crazy fluid. None of our own governmental organizations agree on whether it's, a non-state group that's attacking civilians for a political purpose or a state group, etc. These all change internationally as well as, within the continental US and how we're defining it. But then we look at the United Nations, who put out resolutions on the fact that there's a lack of consensus around the word terrorism. What people typically think they mean is a political act of violence against a civilian population. So if we take that, how come we don't talk about the history of the United States as a state sponsor of terrorism, whether that's Hiroshima and Nagasaki, or sponsoring proxies throughout the Cold War in Latin America, et cetera, right? My point here is one of the problems when we talk about Iran is this assumption that our own side is somehow not a bad actor in other situations, not acting out of its own desire for its interests to be protected, which isn't a moral judgment, right? That's just a political analysis applied to these things. I get kind of frustrated with why are we talking about Iran specifically as an actor that supports proxy violence and state-sponsored terrorism, when if we removed the name of the country and used the same methodological points to apply to other nations, you would have the same thing. That doesn't mean that I'm justifying Iran's actions anywhere, and I'm certainly not a fan of that particular government. But my point here is one of the biggest drivers of divisive sentiment throughout the world vis-a-vis American hegemonic power is disproportionate power and hypocrisy in terms of selectively enforcing these international laws that are supposed to be predicated on universalism and morality and human rights. Does that make sense? So before I can even go there, I have to attack that category.
Well, let's cut it a different way. Instead of getting bogged down with the definitions, and I would tend to agree with you that many countries across the world sponsor what might be termed terrorism. But let's look at it from a slightly different point of view and talk about what you think has happened to our society here in the United States and across others in the world as to where some time ago we tended to resolve disputes through debate and other civil actions as opposed to violence. What has caused this rise where people find that an alternative to get what they want?
Well, I mean, I think I probably will disappoint you with my answer a little bit, because I think that that's a much longer trajectory of history that we have to face. We can't necessarily say that this present era is more prone to violence when we disagree. I think that in some way it's intensified by things that have happened in media with polarization, information, and things like that. But I think what we're seeing now is a magnification of tendencies that have always existed here. Daniel Borstein was a U.S. historian that talked about this thing called the pseudo event, and this was in the early 60s. And he was warning about how media and entertainment and news were all sort of blurring together in politics as well. And over the years, what we've seen since the 60s is politics as entertainment, right? And it's almost as if people forget that they're thinking about, civic society rather than a sports team. And there's a profit margin within that that goes along with changes in the media. So you have an intensification of these sort of communitarian affiliations that I think that's what we're seeing in the present that's really different, not so much the recourse to violence itself, if that makes sense.
I
It's more
understand.
incentivized now.
I understand, but what about the fact that just given today's environment compared to the days of colonial times, George Washington, or even when we were beginning to settle the Wild Wild West, even with the telegraph, it would take days, if not longer, to travel across the country to get messages out, and you were somewhat limited on the number of people you might be able to influence with those messages. Today, with social media and with instant news, 24-hour cable, millions and millions of people can be influenced and activated toward violence in an instant.
Yeah, I perhaps I wasn't clear. That's precisely what I mean. In that what we're seeing now, this point you're making, it's an intensification and an acceleration of tendencies that we've had previously. And a lot of the things that are responsible for this intensification and acceleration are things like the media becoming more incentivized by profit, and social media is a key part of that, right? And entertainment or politics is entertainment, and the ways in which these different spheres of American life have blurred into one another, right? So does that make more sense? Because I absolutely agree with you. I think what makes it more dangerous now that it's more intensified and sped up and across social media is it's easier to weaponize in terms of international relations and in terms of polarization at home because of those factors. But so if that makes more sense, I was trying to clarify, when we don't recognize that we had these tendencies in the past and what factors lead to their particular intensification now, I think it's harder to fight them.
Right. But the risk, I think, is much, much broader.
I
When
agree,
you
yes.
had the Aaron Burr Hamilton duel, there were two people involved, and one person ended up injured and dead. Today, if you do that, and if you influence perhaps thousands or hundreds of thousands or maybe more lone wolves in the country, aren't there a much larger number of people at risk and much less likely to be able to detect and respond?
Yes. I mean,
So I would
I'm sorry, I'm confused. Yeah, absolutely.
let me do this way. I know you've done a lot of work on the homegrown terrorism front. There have been a bunch of hate groups that you've
Hmm.
studied, written about. We can come back to Iran and especially some of the movements that I also know you've written about, where the women, for instance, became martyrs in some cases, to stand up for the same kinds of human rights that many of us think only Americans stand for, which is not
Hmm.
exactly the true narrative. It's a global rise of human rights. But back to homegrown terrorists,
Sure.
what did you learn, or what was alarming to you when you did all that study, with the hate groups? What came out? And I know that there have been some that have targeted you, which is why your picture is not shown right now. Can you speak to some of that?
Sure. I mean, there's a lot of things that have surprised me. I will say that one big surprise has been just how normal and everyday extremists on the far right and neo-Nazis are, in
Mhm.
terms of, no, they're not monsters. They're not stupid, This gets back to, I think, what I wanted to point out at the very beginning, being personally accountable and trying to practice active empathy. There's a very real utility to it. And what I mean by that is, if we dismiss neo-Nazi activism in this country and fascist activism as the product of say stupid, uneducated, poor, white, Southern trash, which is what you hear all of the time. Well, you wind up missing the point that Stephen Miller and Steve Bannon are from Southern California, and they're extremely wealthy and very well educated. And what comes with that is you miss a much broader threat, right? That's more dangerous than some hick in a backwards town that maybe has access to like 5 people he could terrorize, right? You miss the operation of power, I think. And that's been something that has really been shocking in terms of how deeply I've absorbed it. And I think all of us have absorbed that. And that's the kind of thing that I mean we need to be aware of, right? So it's the same kind of principle on an international level as well, I think, if that makes sense. When you cannot imagine the perspective of your so-called enemy or the so-called threat and see it from the other side, because you're granting them full humanity instead of dismissing them as monstrous and irrational, you open yourself up to a world of hurt. And so it might sound counterintuitive, but the absolute necessity to try to assume the perspective of something that you see as the enemy on an equal footing can't be underestimated. And people mistake that for sympathy for a terrorist or, wanting to hold hands with a Nazi. It's absolutely not. It's strategically powerful. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay.
I think that I'm intrigued by this idea of empathy that you led with. I think Larry, I think that's something you're also pointing to more indirectly in terms of like, how did this get so complicated? I mean, why can't we just duel it out and let it stretch over days rather than instantaneous like rage? I think both of you all have, actually, I know you have, Larry, also studied homegrown terrorism and global terrorism. And so I'd like to hear your point of view too, in terms of like what you have found that's been, shocking or that you kept thinking through.
My first encounter with dealing with terrorism was over 50 years ago when there was this group that was very prevalent across the country, and they were a very militarized group. You may have heard of them, Amanda. It was called the Army, the Sword. No, the Covenant.
The Covenant, Sword and Arm, yeah. CSA.
And the Army of the Lord.
Yep.
They had this compound up in the Northwest, and they would carry out their military maneuvers.
Can I jump in? Are you thinking of the Order, or are you thinking of CSA? Because CSA had the compound in Oklahoma.
Well, this was more like Idaho, Montana.
Yeah, that's the Order.
Yeah, but the Order was a shortening from what it was 50 years ago. 50 years ago, it was clearly the Covenant, the Sword, the Order, and the Army of the Lord. That was the broad headline that we, at the FBI and local law enforcement, state level law enforcement, that's the way we talked about them. Now, they did have sort of a southern root, having originated in Arkansas, but they wanted to get away and have their own land and compound, so they moved to the greater Northwest. Are they still around?
The Order or the CSA?
The Order.
Well, that's interesting that you should ask, because in some ways, yes. I mean, the key members that you're talking about that were in the Pacific Northwest, David Lane, et cetera, he's now in prison, or he died in prison. The guy that, originated 14 words that was part of the Order. CSA is defunct. But what's I think more important about the connections here is that both of these groups sprung from Christian identity, a neo-Nazi interpretation of Christian theology that incentivizes race war as a duty for Jesus. And as Larry points out, like in the FBI back in the day, from like the 80s on, this group in particular in Christian identity, the umbrella ideology of white supremacist Christianity that unites them, was responsible for the overwhelming majority of domestic quote-unquote terrorism attacks in this country. And Oklahoma City was very much a part of this broader network. And I think what people really, really, really miss, and it frustrates me to no end, is that Christian identity, the same neo-Nazi theological strain that motivated both of these, or all of these different networks of the same web, is still around. But this is really important. So after Ruby Ridge and after Waco, there was a meeting of guys that were associated, and it's referred to as the Rocky Mountain Rendezvous in Estes Park, Colorado. And they met And with a broad coalition of people that were active in the culture wars on the far right, Larry Pratt from, I can't remember the name of the organization, but it's one step further than the NRA, all of these different far right actors to talk about how to deal with what the government did at Ruby Ridge and Waco. Their solution was to take CI, in part, and essentially step away from the militarized insurgent cell sort of organizational type and focus on infiltration through common shared values and amping up this affiliation with patriotism and loyalty. And one of the big theologians from Christian identity as a whole at that point in time, Pete Peters is a pastor, was the pastor's name. And he said, he gave this sermon, be as wise as the serpent. And it was his take on drop the identity label from Christian identity and cozy up to conservatives around abortion, around all of these different shared things so that you can sort of red pill them towards racism that way. And they have been extraordinarily successful in terms of influencing the broader discourse that we see today. CI is very much around. And people don't recognize what it is, specifically because in the early 90s, this was a tactic undertaken by the militia movement, the far, the patriot movement, etc. So yeah, they're absolutely still around. Their tactics have changed and their, identification has changed. They're 100% still around. And that's where I think this issue of historical lineage really is important to be aware of, because too often we hear people talk about, say, Trump as the problem. And once Trump is gone, these issues will know, like will fascism and kumbaya, post-racial, whatever. That's not the case. And especially not the case if you can't look at the continuous threads that speak to broader social problems we need to address, how we reckon with racism and Christianity in this country and our history. So yeah, they're definitely still around. I mean, you'll see the contemporary neo-Nazi channels on Telegram circulate pictures of Bob Matthews, who was the leader of the order in Washington state that was burned alive in a house during his last stand at this period that Larry is talking about. The 14 words are used all of the time. They were written originally by David Lane, this member of the order that died in prison. And then Tom Metzger, who is an affiliate of the order, is actually responsible for so many of the infiltration successes, let's just say, that we've seen by white supremacists in many, many areas of law enforcement and the military. So their impact was still with us. The valorization of them as, martyrs and icons in the movement is still with us. But most importantly, I think their influence lives on in ways that people do not recognize, specifically because the tactics and strategies changed to avoid detection, push things further right. And that's unfortunately been aided by these polarized discourses where nobody wants to look at where their ideas might come from, because it is very uncomfortable.
Let me ask you this. Does that also tie in to the fact that you do mischaracterize, or we have mischaracterized in the past, as the source of these kinds of feelings coming from Southern, small town, uneducated sheriff, when you also have, even going back some in our history, people like Senator McCarthy, people like the John Birch Society, people like William F. Buckley. And even today, you have very well-educated, very sophisticated minds who you think, like J.D. Vance, might know better because of their pedigree of their education, but they still emote, project, and feed these same violent tendencies.
Mm-hmm. I think this opens up another fantastic area of discussion, because for one thing, I'll start out by saying many of them, they do know better. They absolutely know better. And that is what makes them, in my opinion, absolutely despicable creatures and extremely dangerous as well, right? But
yes.
To touch on that, the second point that I wanted to respond to, I'm so glad that you raised William F. Buckley and the John Birch Society, because once you start looking into the background of the leaders of the contemporary American white supremacist movement, almost all of them came out of the John Birch Society. Damn near every single one.
Wow.
Absolutely.
I didn't know that.
Members of the order did, all of them. And it's interesting when we put it in parallel to where our country has gone, right? And we talk about the small town sheriffs, racism, et cetera, because we have to think about one of the ultimate terms that's thrown around now to delegitimize anyone working on the left and against fascism. It's communism, it's Marxism. Well, you know what this government in the McCarthy era, et cetera, referred to as MLK as, to discredit him, a communist, a Marxist, a tool of the Russians, etc. You've got this same idea, and you see it in hard white supremacist right-wing circles, as well as the softer, more friendly MAGA-adjacent circles, that Antifa is a threat, right? That wants to usher in mass migration, and it's all like it's the same parallels as back in the civil rights aftermath era of the Jews are helping, the Jews are like bringing in brown and black people to destabilize this country and steal it from us, etc. It's the same arguments recycled for a new generation, and it's not an accident. It's because there are smart men and women out there with power that know how to craft these narratives so they're less offensive, quote unquote, now. And that's the shifting of the Overton window that we hear so much about that's been explicitly embraced by a lot of these forces on the far right. I also want to mention, a big shift here that people, I think, are not aware of enough is that during the civil rights era across the South, the role of media and television in that had a big role in terms of some people seeing police violence for the first time against their own citizens. Yeah. And that's the point in time, too, where racism begins to have consequences. So you have to mask it, right? Where did all the Klan leaders that were in law enforcement go during that era? Do we think that the Civil Rights Act passed and they suddenly wanted to be kumbaya? Absolutely not, right? No. They stayed there. Surprise, right? So we have to think about these connections because it has an impact on how, racism has persisted in different forms in different areas, and people are hostile to that. I get a lot of crap from the left when I talk about infiltration because they're like, well, policing is always been racist in this country. Yeah, there's racist origins in slave patrols, absolutely. But here's the huge danger. When you act like there's not a shift in tactics, you're going to miss things, such as civil rights era happens, and for the first time, the idea of being a racist publicly has consequences for your career, and it begins to be seen as a moral failing. What happens? People start hiding it in public and saving it to act out in different areas. And if we're not aware of that stuff, you can't combat it, right? So I think these are all points that we have to keep in mind. And if you look at just the different discussion names that we just threw out, sheriffs in the small town sheriffs in the South, MLK, McCarthy, John Birch Society, Vance, all of these different levels of power have these connections that we have to be really well aware of. And just hating the other side and saying they're stupid and they're ignorant and they're beneath me, we wouldn't have the structures that we have right now if people hadn't dismissed a lot of these heinous, backwards, in my opinion, fascist forces decades ago. We didn't see them coming. We should have.
Let me ask you this. Are you aware of the Reverend Sharpton?
Yes, absolutely.
In my era, the 70s, he was an FBI informant.
Really?
The movement.
Really?
Yes, true story.
Oh, it's fascinating. The new Black Panther Party?
Yes.
Actually hosted Tom Metzger as their keynote speaker around the time of the LA riots. And I have the video in my archive. It's interesting, and people need to know a lot more because it would explain things like how is Enrique Tarrio the head of, a white supremacist, masquerading as Western civilization organization. There's always been this kind of alliance with different separatists. So I have this video that just blew my mind. And Metzger speaking at the new Black Panther Party, and I will say new, not the original, big difference. But
right.
He's speaking, and at the end of his talk, the guy that invited him gives him this huge hug in front of the microphone. Someone in the audience asks, it's all well and good that you're cooperating now, but like what happens after the race war? Both of them laugh. I'm just saying, like, we'll get to it then. So, there's always been this sort of symbiotic cooperation between groups that want division for different ends, right? And people need to be aware that you can be played by a group that, you're ostensibly allied with, I guess, because a lot of these divisive factors work the same way, I suppose I'm saying. And it's great cover for them. Like Enrique Tarrio is a great person for the Proud Boys to hold up and say we're not racist, but who did they sacrifice first? Like tokens for these groups have a very useful role.
What about the impact of the so-called diversification or browning of America? Does that give rise to more fear in, say, the now shrinking, I think since the year 2013, the one thing that white people have failed to do is to reproduce themselves every year since 2013. In other words, more of them died than are born each year.
I think that's an interesting. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
And so does that give further justification to their striking out at some of these other groups?
Yeah, no. I think this is a really complex question because there's a fear on some among some elements that oppose like this racist fascist resurgence to talk about the demographic shift that's coming that you articulate as what's commonly, the brownification of America or what have you. It's a fact that I think by like 2055, or I can't remember the precise date, that the United States will be a country in which white people are the minority. It's, been the ticking time bomb is what Richard Spencer and a lot of the racial eugenicists call it now. But there is a shift coming because of migration where white people will be the minority. And that's very threatening to these groups. Very threatening. It's threatening to people that don't see themselves as white supremacists, because it's the unfamiliar. And the unfortunate thing here is that's a reality, right? That's going to happen. I don't think that's unfortunate at all. The unfortunate thing is that this is something that can be used so efficaciously as a narrative warfare weapon by a lot of groups that I think that's the big issue. And so people don't want to touch it because they want to pretend like, the racist right that's afraid of the brownification of America is just full of crap and they don't know what they're talking about. There's no basis. Well, the complaint that they have that this will be a country where whites are the minority it's true. It will be. Now, what we do about that, whether that's good or bad, is a different discussion. But when you want to dismiss their grievances as completely insane and stupid and ignore the basis in some kind of fact, you can't go about defanging them or even having a conversation. It just locks you into this self-sustaining polarization, if that makes sense. I mean, I personally think it's a fantastic thing that that's happening in this country. But there's a lot of people that don't want to even admit that there is a demographic shift underway. And why does this matter for anything beyond just racist sentiment? Because demographics and politics and how our system works means there's an incentive for people to run with the fear-mongering implications of what that shift might mean. And this is one of the reasons, too, that like even right after January 6th, I was very upset by all of the calls from the Democrats to use to up domestic terrorism legislation. Like, here's the thing, because that category is so loose and easy to abuse. The people that they wanted to use it on, the Democrats at that time, are this group I'm talking about that's afraid of the backlash and, the changing of their country. That's who the left wanted to call terrorists. But now, when we have who in power, right? Look at how the terrorism label is being shifted and who is it applied to now? Someone like Mahmoud Khalil, who was using free speech, and like how that is positioned, right? It's applied to the left. It's applied to racially coded groups that are marginalized and that the left post January 6th was ostensibly trying to protect, but that's not how it works.
Isn't there really a big game of scapegoating going on? In fact, I think as opposed to the demographic changing, shifting jobs, for example, from white groups to minority groups, I think shifting jobs overseas and automation have more impact on the loss of certain jobs than any particular group.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think there's an element of that, but when we talk about shifting jobs overseas and automation, are we talking about, the Elon Musks who have the capital and the power and are making the decisions to do that, right? Or are we talking about the workers abroad that are, predominantly people of darker skin color that get blamed for this stuff? So there's a disconnect, I think, when we just don't look at the difference in wealth and income and how these things are being exported overseas. Like, business owners in the States who rely on undocumented workers for their businesses, yet rarely face consequences for that, even in the rhetoric of the parties that, lambast quote unquote illegal immigrants, right? But there's not a conversation about the owners that make that happen. And a really good parallel here is, yeah, we had the same scapegoating in the slavery era, right? Like putting whites in as overseers and using basically whites lower down on the chain to say, well, look, you're not a slave, right? You have power over someone. Like that's how the system has worked since its inception. We're seeing the same thing, and in this country, scapegoating has a very real tie to racial characteristics and how they're perceived, and there's no way around that. It's tied to wealth as well. So I think that that's another thing where we have these histories that we don't really interrogate as connected to the present, and they are intensified now, and they still exist. But there are things like the acceleration and the intensity that have upped that make them even more dangerous. And if we really want to attack and dismantle them, we can't look at them as something disconnected from the past, but how all of these things implicate one another, if that makes sense. That's just my particular take.
Well, with all of your breadth of experience and knowledge, what do we have to be hopeful about?
Good question. Yeah.
I think there's plenty to be hopeful about, but I can't say on the international macro level ever. Because, I mean, there's a reason that I get nicknamed like the Cassandra of geopolitics by people. I can't look at it. This is not going to happen. The good news is that for me, on an interpersonal level, there's a great amount of reasons to have hope. And what's fantastic and serendipitous about that, to my mind, is that is exactly the same kind of thing that is a weapon, in my opinion, to address the future macro. Because the only way that things are going to get better is working at the macro level, like taking accountability, being very aware about your own implication in these things. And that strengthens the relationships you need to sustain you throughout these times, but it's also your weapon against what could come otherwise. So really, we don't have any other choice but to act that way. Otherwise, you just lay down and die. And I think one story that is a good anecdote about this that shocked the hell out of me.
A minute. Amanda, you cut out on this, so I want you to take a deep breath and start over, okay?
So I think I have an anecdote that, to my mind, ties together what we opened with and this great last question about hope. So bear with me because it might seem kind of convoluted at first. But I was friends with the American journalist that ISIS beheaded, and that really impacted me for many, many, many reasons. But I ended up needing to view the videos of those executions. And it taught me a lot about how propaganda functions and how, dismissing propaganda's multiple actions and our own susceptibility is the most dangerous thing that you can do. And this is tied to empathy. What I mean by that is, so those videos are very much set up, unlike other jihadi executions, to make you see the victim as a victim, to make you empathize with the person they're killing, not demonizing them. And that's really powerful because it overrides rational, analytical resistance to let's go to an annihilation, all-out war. It worked on me, right? And I've lived in the region and have, family and friends who are Muslim and brown. And when I saw those executions, my first thought was, 10 seconds of burn Syria to the ground. I don't care who dies. And I'm talking about friends of mine, right? It was just an instantaneous reaction and thirst for revenge. And that scared the hell out of me because I know better. And if I know better, what does that mean for anybody else? So I had to start reckoning with this. And then I got asked about Shamima Begum, the girl in the UK that left to join ISIS when she was 14. And
Right.
I ended up doing this long Twitter thread about teaching that subject to my students because they asked me to, because I said it's a terrible idea to take her citizenship. And my students were shocked and they were like, but these were your friends. How could you think that? That's so stupid, whatever. So I walked them through the whole process of like forcing myself to look at what the function of those videos was meant to do. It was meant to, make us see like white American men as the most valorized things on the planet. And because ISIS wants an apocalyptic war. So it was bait. I got recruited for half a second to the enemy side, right? Because I wasn't thinking about how I'm susceptible. Anyway, I was walking my students through how and what ISIS wants, like division between Muslim and non-Muslim, West and non-West, which is, never going to happen because it's a fake idea. But how they enact that by brutalizing people like Jim and Stephen and making these divides. And how Shamima Begum's not looking at that propaganda. She's looking at propaganda that looks at how the US failed in Iraq to provide what they promised. That doesn't mean that I approve or agree with the propaganda, but it's a fact that that's what she's exposed to, not the bloody beheading stuff. There's different genres of this propaganda stuff meant to target different people. And unless you're willing to take a hard look at the fact that Shamima Begum's not a monster, she was 14, her brain's not going to finish developing for another 11 years. What do you do with that in repatriation and all the implications? And so I did this huge Twitter thread about it. And I thought, yeah, I'm going to get some more death threats, big deal, whatever. And I did have some people that were like, oh, I hope you get raped to death and, whatever. I hope ISIS decapitates you next. After I talked about how I don't like ISIS because they killed my friends, and people responded to that with good. I hope they kill you too because you like them, which is such a great cognitive dissonance moment, right? But what shocked me and wraps this up, I think, I talked over and over again in that thread about empathy and how that's not the same thing as sympathy. And if you underestimate your opponent and you cannot see where they're coming from, you'll never, ever, ever be able to fight this. But the reaction on Twitter, and this is before Elon, so it wasn't, the swamp of absolute crap that it is now, but the reaction was insane in a good way, which shocks me to my core. I mean, I have a file on my computer of screenshots I took of the responses, and I still cry when I think about it. I mean, I had people writing me from like conscripts going into the Indian Army that were going to go to Kashmir and being like, I never thought about this before, and what am I doing with my life? And this is really upsetting, and I'm glad you made us sit through it, right? And how it applied to different contexts. And it was mind-blowing how many people were able to hear that, right? Even though it was uncomfortable, and look at their own really heinous inclinations and how they're susceptible to this stuff. And I think that part of the reason that was able to happen was, I made myself super vulnerable. It's not fun, openly admitting saying I wanted Syria to burn to the ground for 10 seconds because like 2 of my white dude friends died, even though way more of my Muslim, brown and black, friends and family have died. Like, that's not fun to admit to anyone that you have that impulse. But if you don't, you're never going to be able to catch it in yourself, stop it in yourself, or help anybody else. You're going to be the puppet of propaganda forever, accidentally contributing to the very same thing that you think you're opposing. So that gives me substantial hope when I think about how people reacted. And that in turn gives me the strength to, keep that approach up, because I think that part of that is the accountability and trust and active cultivation of empathy and willingness to be wrong. And let me just tell you that's hard stuff, right? But it's the most liberating, empowering thing in the world. And frankly, it's the only thing that keeps me wanting to wake up in the morning. Does that answer your question?
Absolutely.
Fantastic.
Larry, what about you? What do you take as something that we can lean in with hope about?
Well, I guess much as Amanda does, you have to really go back and put all of this into a context.
Mm-hmm.
And in some ways, we look at it and we tend to say these are the worst of times. But if you put it in a full context of people in this country being under the whim of King George before we had a constitution, and going through the Civil War, going through World War I, going through pre-World War II and World War II, Vietnam after that, and even looking at many of the other crises we have faced and overcome, things today fit more in a pattern where it's not unfair or extreme to believe that we can overcome this too.
Mhm.
Whether you talk about lynchings or you talk about the freedom rides through the South or the lunch counters, America has faced a lot of challenges. And yes, we do face serious challenges today, and we do face them, as we mentioned in earlier conversation, with different kinds of media, different kinds of technology, different kinds of reaching a larger proportion of all the people in the country. And of course, we have a lot more people in the country now.
Mm-hmm.
When I was born, there was more like 100 million people in the country.
Mm-hmm.
And believe it or not, now we have over 350 million people in the country.
Mm-hmm.
But today, you can probably reach all of them in a matter of minutes. So, looking back at the past, putting today in some context, I continue to believe, as Amanda does, that there's reason to have hope.
Yeah. Well, what I've heard both of you say is a couple of threads that you can sort of disagree with me about or restate in your own words. But what I've heard you say is we've pulled these different pieces through this hour. I've heard you say that there's always been a level of violence in the human being that in a collective kind of way can be used, especially when you insert propaganda and change the mind or frame up who the enemy might be. And so what I also hear is that the same human being, the same human experience, the capacity for empathy is what will save us. Whether it be for nuclear war or for changing our opinions and for realigning towards the creation of a new story. Amanda, I'm glad you told about your friend. I didn't want to put you on the spot to say that, but
No, it's okay.
I actually sat with you while you were watching.
Yeah, you
and
did.
You watched it over and
You're the
over and
one that pushed me into to working on this publicly. You're the first person that I remember distinctly at the it was a Java. What's the spot in 5 Points?
It
I
was.
remember exactly where we were sitting, and I remember crying to you and saying, like, when I'm watching it, like, the fact I know why I'm having this reaction, and it's because I have been socialized to see white American men as more valuable than anyone else, even though I know damn well that that's not the case, even though that's not even like my family and friends, right? And I remember saying to you, I feel like I need to speak publicly on this, but it's so gross. Is that like a cynical, using my friend's death, but all of my work is about the ethics of representation and anti-racism, and like, what is the line? And you told me you have to do this. It's not about using your friend's deaths for your career. It's about the fact that your ethics align with what you do, and there's something urgent here that you need to warn people about, right? And you can only do that by laying yourself bare. And I wasn't going to put you on the spot, but that's to your credit that I ever started working on any of this, because I didn't want to, it wasn't even so much like, I'm fine with admitting that I love making mistakes, because otherwise I wouldn't want to live. Like, I want to learn things for the rest of my life. But saying like I did a dumb thing or had a bad reaction and knowing that doesn't make me a bad person is one thing, right? But when you're talking about the loss of someone in this kind of way, and a loss that has very real implications for like geopolitical security and peace and apocalyptic warfare, that's a different question, or it was at the time. Like, is this like one of those gross, like, instant Iran experts on Twitter that is like, oh, they don't know about the Iran-Iraq war, but they want to weigh in on nuclear capabilities, and they don't know that, Persian and Arabic aren't the same language. There's just like, so I didn't want the ethics of that feeling like I was using it in a gross way. But then, Melissa kind of smacked me down and said, this is, your personal, your politics and your professional all together. And it helped me realize that if I didn't address it publicly, I don't believe in anything that I stand for. And people that wanted to see it that way could have seen it in a way of cynicism. But by and large, I don't think I ever heard that, which is just kind of now occurring to me. But so I think it's done a lot of good. And that's something that's attributable to you.
Well, no, I was sitting there as a witness to you. And
No, hold on. Because it was the open space that you were holding for me in that time to be vulnerable and have those conversations and not be afraid of how I would be perceived, right? And that kind of attitude in a one-to-one like friend capacity about very raw, horrific things, I think is what I'm trying to get at, right? Because you didn't have, I knew you had the empathy to hear me saying like, this is my awful reaction, even though I know where it comes from. What do I do with that? And I think that is how you can step by step fight what's coming, basically. And really, we don't have another choice, honestly. I mean, what gives you hope? Nah, bro, we're way past that. We don't get to ask what gives you hope. No, what you will cling to hope or else, right? Because it's the same human tendency. We're our own worst enemies. And we now have the technology to do worse things, but we can do better things. And until we recognize that first and foremost, we are our own worst enemies for all of these reasons, we can't address it. So cling to hope or die. And it starts with one-to-one. Solidarity begins at home.
Yeah, that's good.
To me.
Yeah, I'm proud of you, Amanda. And I love you.
I love you too. And I'm proud of you. And thankful. And very thankful.
And I'm glad you're getting to meet my friend and co-host.
It was lovely, Larry. Nice to meet you. I'd love to talk further at some point.
The feeling is mutual, and I appreciate you being our witness today and presenting the world with more of your experience and expertise. It certainly informed me, and I'm sure Melissa feels similarly, but I think there are people out there who need to hear some of this who are perhaps even less informed than we were.
Yeah. Well, those of you who have been listening in, please share this episode and please ask questions. I'll be sure to get your questions to Amanda and or to Larry. And thank you again for listening. This is the Voices of Americans.